Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to NICE International Conference on Understanding China. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, peace is advocated. Today's conference is organized under China Studies Center. China Studies as a whole brings into perspective the rising powers mounting economic, military and diplomatic cloud that certainly has the aptitude to either overturn or sustain the current contemporary world order. The center broadly examines China's international strategic thinking and conduct foreign and security policy and the impact of domestic politics and economy on China's foreign relations. It further addresses China's emergence in the face of the world in flux, domestic politics, economy, society, culture, People's Liberation Army and Tibet Autonomous Region, and most importantly, her engagement with each of South Asian countries. The conference has 26 scholars and from 19 countries of 5 continents. There are 4 sessions. The program is also being broadcasted live on a YouTube channel, NICE Nepal. Please subscribe and share it on social media. This is the 4th session of the conference and each speaker will have maximum 10 minutes for their presentation. The audience can ask questions only via chat. This session will be moderated by Dr. Namrata Goswami. We would like to welcome our moderator, Dr. Namrata Goswami. Dr. Namrata Goswami is an independent analyst and author on space policy, great power politics, and ethnic conflicts. She is a subject matter expert in international affairs with the Futures Laboratory, Alabama, USA, and guest lecturer, India Today class, Emory University. After earning her PhD in International Relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University, she served for nearly a decade as research fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyst, New Delhi, working on ethnic conflicts in India's northeast and China-India border conflict. Her research and expertise generated opportunities for collaborations abroad, and she accepted visiting fellowships at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo, Norway, the La Trobe University, Melbourne, Australia, and the University of Heidelberg, Germany. In 2012, she was selected as Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the United States Institute of Peace, Washington, D.C., and was awarded a Fulbright Nehru Senior Fellowship the same year. Shortly after relocating to the US, she established her own strategy policy consultancy in 2016. In 2016 and 17, she won the prestigious Menera grant awarded by the Office of the US Secretary of Defense to study great power competition in the gray zone of outer space. In 2017, she was awarded a contract with Joint Special Forces University to write a monograph on ISIS in Asia. In April 2019, Dr. Goswami testified before the US-China Economic Security Review Commission on China's space program. Dr. Goswami is the first representative from South Asia chosen to participate in George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies NATO Partnership for Peace Consortium, Emerging Security Challenges Working Group. He received the Executive Leadership Certificate sponsored by the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, National Defense University, and the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Her latest book on the Naga ethnic movement for a separate homeland, Stories from the Field, has been published by Oxford University Press in March 2020. Her forthcoming book is on great power competition in outer space, to be published by Lexington Press, an imprint of Roman and Littlefield. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Gupta, that was a very, I'm very honored by that introduction, and welcome to all the panelists. I'm looking forward to a very interesting session, especially in the context of understanding China. To understand China is critical in terms of China's influence in the world, in terms of geopolitics, and also in terms of long-term normative building of the international order. So in session 4, this particular conference is organized by NICE, and very grateful for having this conference as well as this session. So session 4 is going to be extremely interesting. We have a very interesting mix of speakers, and as Ms. Gupta mentioned, each speaker will have about 10 minutes. And so we look forward to a conversation of about 2 hours in terms of what was given to me. So without further ado, let me invite Dr. Irina Ionela, who's the Director and Senior Research Fellow for the Asia Pacific Program, the Center for Geopolitics and Security in Realism Studies, United Kingdom. That's very interesting, Realism Studies. That should be an interesting conversation itself. She's going to talk on China's foreign policy under Xi. Irina, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Namrata. Today, I will point out several ideas from an older article of mine about China's foreign policy under Xi Jinping. First of all, I want to say that since 2002, China leaders have characterized the initial 2 decades of the 21st century as a period of strategic opportunity for expanding China's national power. First of all, Xi Jinping administration introduced several changes in terms of institutional and military reforms. For example, recently they removed the constitutional term limits of the presidency, and of course he put in all top posts and at almost every minister, let's say a party apparatus which favors his policy. In terms of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we can say that the employees are selecting from the most known from the top universities in Beijing and Shanghai. And of course, there were some changes regarding also the committees and commissions on foreign policy. For example, in 2013, we had the Central Committee, which the 18th Central Committee established a National Security Commission to improve national security system and strategy in order to guarantee China's national security. Furthermore, we can say that this National Security Commission main responsibilities include decision-making, deliberation, coordination of national security work, and of course is in charge of overall plans and coordinating major issues of foreign policy. In addition to top-level design, another element of Xi foreign policies is the so-called bottom-line thinking. And we talk about here about the military budget, which grew at an average of 9.8% per year from 2006 until today. People Liberation Army modernization includes power projection, sea lane security, counter-piracy, peacemaking, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and so on. Finally, we talk about a new doctrine regarding the maritime security, and the new naval doctrine of far sea defense for projection of power far from its shores. And in this respect, China has invested heavily in anti-access and area denial capabilities and seeks to deter or defeat third-party intervention during a large center theater campaign. Regarding the neighborhood diplomacy, Xi administration brought the so-called new security concept for Asia. And at a conference in 2013, Xi Jinping outlined the importance and future direction of China diplomatic relationship with neighboring countries. And we see that China's dreams has become Asia-Pacific dream. This reflects how China watch and integrate the neighbors and the neighborhood policy as a step towards great power policy. And of course, we have several issues here. We talk about the South China Sea, the relation with Taiwan and with India and all the Southeast Asia. Finally, if we talk about, the recent white papers of China security policy, they call for relevant bilateral military alliance to become more transparent and avoid confrontation. And of course, for improving coordination between existing mechanisms. So we can see that the People Liberation Army is seen to engage more inclusively in the neighborhood area. Regarding the new model of great power relations, we can say that Xi Jinping foreign policy began with a greater involvement in international institutions such as United Nations, World Trade Organization, and so on. But also China looks to establish differentiate relations with major actors such as Russia, European Union, and of course the biggest rivalry, United States now. Well, great power diplomacy during Xi Jinping changed in 2013, 2014, when for example, at the first meeting with President Obama, he said that the vast Pacific Ocean is big enough for the two powers. So from there we can see that they look at themselves as equals, and of course this trend is very visible now. If we talk about U.S. China trade war now and all the other, let's say, all the other disputes they have. And of course that for United States also China is the biggest challenge for their geopolitics, if we can say. And we can say that Brzezinski, for example, predicted this thing, and other geopoliticians even before 2000. Well, what we know now, that firstly, China is an economic power, at least when we talk about economic imperative terms and all kinds of indicators. China achieved and succeed to establish a network of friends. And of course, when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, it tried to use this initiative in order to enhance its diplomatic and goals, and to get other goals in other areas. And of course, we talk about the thing that for Xi Jinping, foreign policy and diplomatic success are linked. And we have here the nationalistic appeals for domestic audience. And the foreign policy is seen as a way to legitimate power also at the domestic level. So all these initiatives and multi-layer diplomacy, we can say, are all interlinked, and we can observe that China has a great power strategy already, and as I said with other occasions, its strategy is not just for South Asia, Southeast Asia, it's for all the world. Well, the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as the US-China trade war, had brought also some risks for China's foreign policy. For example, international actors such as Japan, Malaysia, the European Union began to, let's say, push back China's initiative in the area of, for example, of economic
Dr. Kwok, you have about 1 minute left.
Yes, and so we will see how all these various diplomatic, military, economic strategy will work in the context, of course, of the COVID-19 pandemic, will work in favor or against China. So I hope that we will debate this today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. I thought your point about, first of all, I think what you raised was the national structuring of institutionalization of national security. I think that has been very clear under President Xi. I think the other point you raised, which I think we'll discuss in the question answer, is how China's foreign policy engagement under is actually related to its domestic politics. And I think that's a very important point. So let's get back to that once we have the question and answer session. Thank you so much for your presentation. So the next speaker is Dr. Uma Purushothaman. She's an assistant professor with the Department of International Relations and Politics, Central University of Kerala. And today she's going to present on China-Russia relations, the Indian perspective. The floor is yours, Dr. Uma, and you have 10 minutes. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Goswami. I would also like to thank Pramod for inviting me for this conference. Well, all of us are people who study international relations here, so I believe all of us understand that Russia and China have a strategic partnership. So I'm not going to go into the details of it because of lack of time. But first, why is this relationship important? For one, this is a relationship which can really change regional and global power equations. If you look back at the Cold War history, you would see that the rapprochement between China and the United States really tilted the scales in favor of the United States in the 1970s and later. Second, it is a very unique relationship in the sense that you have two neighboring countries, both of which are great powers, and you have one which is rising and the other is declining. And all of this is happening very strangely, very, very peacefully. And there is absolutely no power transition dynamic which is at play here. And this makes the relationship, I think, quite unprecedented if you look at history. So I thought I'd do this presentation by addressing 5 questions. And since we are doing this webinar on understanding China, I thought it would be a good idea to start off by understanding why China needs Russia. For one, we all know that China and Russia are neighbors. They share around 4,300 kilometers in borders. And China, given the way it is, it's acting like a revisionist power, but really it cannot afford to antagonize all of its neighbors, and particularly those in the north. Again, if you go back to history, the Chinese built the Great Wall to stop invaders from the north, and Russia is towards China's north. The second reason is that China needs allies. Very recently, the influential Chinese scholar Yang Shutong said that China has only got one ally, Pakistan. So an ally like Russia is useful to China. Russia is a growing market for Chinese goods. It is the 10th largest market for China. China sees Russia as a powerhouse of energy products and other raw materials. And then, of course, the all-important US factor, go back to the adage of my enemy's enemy is your friend, is my friend, could be applied currently when you look at China-Russia's relations right now. And I think both Russia and China understand that it is for them very difficult to stand up alone against the US-led alliance system, because they do not really have truly powerful allies of their own. Then at the multilateral level, they often work in tandem. They are engaged in several multilaterals. Russia has accepted the BRI. In fact, there is even a promise to link the Eurasian Union with the BRI. They also have very similar views on Western ideas of universal human rights and democracy, and both of them see these are just ploys to create trouble for them. On the other hand, why is it that China is important to the Russians? Again, the same thing. They have a common enemy. They have a common dissatisfaction with US hegemony. Russia is in need of investments, particularly after the sanctions, after the Ukrainian crisis, and China is now the largest Asian investor in Russia. China is Russia's largest trading partner. Bilateral trade has crossed $110 billion last year, even though the EU as a whole is still the largest trading partner. Again, Russia wants to diversify its energy supplies. It does not want monopoly by Europe, particularly because of the collapse of oil prices. And we all know that China is the largest oil importer globally. So Russia looks at China as a stable market for its energy supplies. Again, Russia also does not want a troublesome neighbor, and China supplies a lot of vital components for Russia's advanced weapons system. Again, Putin has made fighting against the hegemony of the dollar one of his key priorities, and therefore the yuan is becoming a bigger part of Russia's foreign exchange currencies. And again, around 50% of Russia-China trade is in local currency. Finally, there is a political point to all of this. China is the source of networking and security apparatus to Russia, and Putin wants to control the Russians through mass surveillance programs, which the Chinese have already been using. For instance, the facial recognition program has been used by Russia to find people who violated the quarantine. So in fact, the COVID-19 crisis has only brought them closer. The third question I wanted to address is how strong are these relations? If you look at military ties, Russia has been selling arms and military technology to China since 1992. 70% of China's arms imports between 2014 to 2018 were from Russia. And Russia is China's largest arms supplier. They've been conducting a lot of exercises together. People have positive views of each other. In fact, last year in a Pew poll, the most positive ratings of China were from the Russians. There's a huge tourism industry. There are 2 million Chinese tourists visited. This is 30% of Russia's tourism came from China last year alone. Putin has described China-Russia relations as alliance-like. Xi Jinping has called Putin his best friend during a state visit to Russia last year. But they basically prefer the formula of never against each other, but not always with each other formula for Sino-Russian ties. And this formula actually gives them reassurance and flexibility, which is something which both powers want. And it also issues the tricky question of hierarchy. So yes, China-Russia relations are pretty strong, though they are not allies in the classic sense. Are there any problems in the relationship? Yes. Trade is concentrated in natural resources, making it neo-colonial in nature, and Russia does not want to become a resource appendage to China. In fact, 70% of Russia's exports to China is basically energy. Russia as a great power, country which has been a superpower, a great empire, does not want to become a junior partner to China. China has overtaken Russia to become the second largest arms producer, and Russian firms have often accused China of illegally copying or reverse engineering their military hardware. In the South China Sea, Russia stands as neutral. I mean, it is, and in fact, it's even collaborating with the Vietnamese. It has very strong ties with Vietnam, and it is also exploring for oil and gas in waters that Vietnam claims as its own. And there is, of course, the legacy of history in the Russian Far East, particularly because the Russians are worried about the signification of the Russian Far East, which the Chinese think were taken away from them through unequal treaties in the late 19th century. And there is also a demographic imbalance between the Russian Far East and the 3 adjoining Chinese provinces. So again, there is this whole history which can come back to trouble them. China does not recognize Crimea as part of Russia. There are problems also in the Arctic because Russia sees itself as an Arctic power. It wants to be the preponderant power there. It does not want China, it does not like China's activism in the Arctic. Similarly, in Central Asia, Chinese rising influence, both economically and politically, is something which worries the Russians because they see Central Asia as being part of their, sphere of influence. Of course, for both countries, and this is something which really needs to be discussed, for both countries, the most important relationship is with the United States. And if there is an re-engagement with the US, with either of these countries, the glue which is binding them would, I think, be diluted very significantly. And the final problem that they have is that they both have very different relations with India. China sees India as a rival. Russia has a relationship of great trust with India, even though a lot of it is shrouded in nostalgia. And that brings me to the last question of how India sees these relations. One of the reasons, according to some scholars, for the Sino-Soviet split during the Cold War was that the USSR refused to support China during the Sino-Indian War of 1962 because it did not want to choose between a friend and a brother. And again, 1971, we know that the USSR support was crucial for India during the Indo-Pak War. So Russia is an important partner for India, but India is very concerned about Russia-China relations because of the tensions between India and China. And post-Galwan, it is very difficult to imagine relations, going back to normal with the Chinese anymore. And India's worry is particularly because of its dependence on arms sales from Russia. 60 to 70% of our arms imports are still from Russia. And we also need very regular supplies of spare parts and repairs as well from the Russians. So relations, but the advantage of Russia-China relations for India is that they are useful in the sense that Russia can facilitate dialogue between India and China when tensions get really high, like recently when it became a very key diplomatic player. I think there were reports that the Russians facilitated the exchange of Indian soldiers who were captured by the Chinese at Galwan. So in a sense, it can be useful for India, but generally the Sino-Russian relationship could force India to become much more Western oriented and to embrace the West. And this could have long-term implications for India-Russia relations. I think I've used up my 10 minutes, so on time. Thank you so much. I look forward to questions and answers. Questions from you.
Sure, thank you, Uma. You finished right on time, so I'm grateful for that. I think your presentation raised certain, I thought, interconnecting issues. One was, of course, you raised the strategic interest-determined relationship between China and Russia. It was interesting to see how tourism and market plays a role as well in that particular relationship. But I thought the most important point you raised is how they are actually navigating their rise and decline within an American-led world order and how that's going to impact. I thought you raised a very important point about Russia's own discomfort with the fact that it's declining, especially given its history. We'll get back to you again, so thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
So our next presenter is Jumel Gabilan Estrañero. He is a defense and security research analyst with the Office of the President, Philippines, and lecturer at Lyceum of the Philippines. The presentation today is going to be on negotiating with China-ness in a multipolar security order, the political economy of South China Sea dispute in ASEAN and Philippine perspective in the midst of VUCA world. The floor is yours, Jumel.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Jumel from the Philippines, and I'm very thankful, by the way, for the opportunity to speak in this international conference hosted by NIIC of Nepal, and at the same time, I'm very thankful for this opportunity to represent the Philippines because most of the conferences that I've been attending, there are Western counterparts at the same time, dominant actors from the Asian countries, by the way, like China and Japan Indonesia, etc. And I hope this presentation would be able to tackle about the perspective of Filipinos. So let me share my screen, by the way. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen, by the way?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Okay, while I'm showing this, I just want to thank again um, my family for supporting this, like my mother and father, my siblings, and my girlfriend is actually watching right now, Miss Tina Siwagan. And of course, Dr. Namrata Goswami for this opportunity to moderate this particular session or the last session. I'll be talking about the context of a Pinoy perspective, of a Filipino perspective regarding this um, South China Sea dispute, and of course, the very important of so-called Chinaness in a multipolar security order. So this is gonna be the outline of the presentation. It will tackle the global and regional security order. Second would be the background or the Philippines and West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea being called by by the international actors, by the way, and the implication, analysis, assessment, and forecast, recommendation, and conclusion plus the way ahead, and of course the call to action. Okay. So this is actually the global and regional multipolar security order. From this particular slide, you are seeing that multipolarity in global and regional order is not new among scholars of political science and international IR, no, or the international relations. And we are familiar with the system where several states possess a considerable degree of political influence. There lies the multipolarity. And of course, the best example that the world before is the World War I. And this, I have included these two figures here. These two images at the top portion of slide wherein it shows at the leftmost part is the probability and results of overt conflict into different international systems. Second would be the probability and results of overt conflict before the line or the PD, as you see, and the line PD, wherein the nuclear weapons have become available to a large number of states. However, as of today, the multipolar security order has reached political economy in distress and pressure. That, as you see right now, we have COVID-19, but at the same time, China, US are having a problem when it comes to their treatment in terms of trade. So we have economics and security dilemma, and the facilitation of the architecture and the international investment dynamics has been affected. And the US Saudi strategic, on the other hand, partnership has weathered 7 decades of multiple regional wars. So today, Saudi Arabia's military expenditures account for more than 10% of its GDP, which ranks fourth among the world's largest military spenders. In relative terms, that's 3 as much of the US and 5 times as much of China. Okay, and for the next slide, I've actually put a caption here: asymmetric relation, which is made of two distinct subrelations, A to B, and of course B vis-a-vis A, in showing us that our security order right now is under VUCA, or VUCA, or volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I believe everybody would agree on the right side that even we are in the state A and state B, the connections of these relations, sub-relation states have been having frictions when it comes to their concerns, whether politically, economically, militarily, and of course, right now, the health security like the COVID-19. So the result is actually giving some resistance and defiance among states. We have Eastern Europe or former Soviet Union, wherein Russia is quite dominant. The Middle East, we have Iran. East or Southeast Asia, we have China. In Latin America, we have Venezuela or Brazil. So in this, we are seeing that the entire world is in the battlefield, and here's how it's arranged. That even though that there is what we call the R&D course, the US is currently engaged in a global campaign to push back against the multipolarity and prolong the unipolar moment. This epic struggle is taking place across all continents with specific resistant and defiant, and their affiliated economic and infrastructural interests being targeted for destabilizations. Now, the entire plan is based on a clearly defined pattern approach against each adversary. And the following article is in the following narrative that being imposed by these states are quite simplified overview of how the US is effectively waging the world war in the 21st century to retain its superpower status. Not to mention, of course, China is, of course, challenging this status quo. Now, meanwhile, we have Russia on the other hand, wherein the R&D course is associated with a certain major infrastructural project that would spread and solidify multipolarity throughout its respective region. So these said projects are opposed by the US, which will do everything it can within its power, whether it has yet to demonstrate this or already has to stop them. So I believe that we are familiar with the first three, Russia, Iran, and China, but the last part, Latin America, wherein the Nicaragua Canal is situated, it is actually exposing the certain extension of the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership in Latin America than a project associated with Venezuela, Brazil, although it has definitely has indirect benefits to them as well. So right now we are seeing this Pacific Alliance today in order to best establish a targeted R&D course, as I mentioned earlier. The US has taken to delegating specific bilateral and multilateral partnerships to act as convenient for the regional proxies for its plans. For example, the NATO, GCC, and of course, we have the US Supervised Mutual Security Arrangement versus China, and the US and Japan, South Korea, where in the Philippines triangle plus an emerging ASEAN NATO-like entity between Vietnam and the land component in the Philippines, or the sea component, as joint course. We also have the rival economic blocks here of the Russia in the Eurasian Union, Syria and the 5C strategy, and of course China with the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. So the US does not want the R&D course to succeed, I believe, in the creation of economic blocks that can rival its neoliberal world order. And just as with the major regional infrastructures, it has set out to destroy them. I do not have to discuss it, but of course, the backdrop of this back in 2001 and the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 had fairly short-term impacts of oil prices, which this image actually portrays. As long as Saudi Arabia and the rest of the OPEC operated to ensure adequate oil supplies in the world markets. So when prices began to soar once again, like in 2009, they were no longer fueled by the US-led advanced economies, but China and large emerging economies. Additionally, there is a fluctuation wherein we attributed to post-Iraq war instability, insurgencies, US occupation of Iraq, and financial bubbles in the West. So when the global crisis took off its fall in 2008, the prices boomed and burst. Crude Brent prices did return to almost $130 by early 2011, and as a result of stimulus packages, recovery policies and non-traditional monetary policies in the ailing West. Okay. in the West right now, there's the plunging prices are, which is of course sometimes attributed to Iran's re-entry into the oil market. In reality, its sanctions were lifted months after the worst oil collapse. Others claim that this collapse of oil stems from China's decelerations. However, while China's growth has slowed, its per capita incomes are increasing, and oil imports continue to grow at close to 9% year on year. Okay? And the next slide. Sorry. And the next slide here, we are seeing there is a trend between multipolarity to unipolarity, but at the same time, we cannot undermine its legitimacy.
Sorry, Jumel, you have about a minute to wrap up.
Okay. Sorry. So we are seeing the center of gravity of political economy of the multipolar security order right now, specifically in the Asia Pacific, centers in the South China Sea, wherein the politics is of course in high note, and at the same time in economics based on Ethel Solingen's highlights, and two main reasons why free trade agreements are being questioned by the ASEAN member states. In the China strategic outlook, we are seeing that the China's a new security concept, and here's this being the centerfold of the power back in the South China Sea, where the disputed claims among Taiwan, China, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines, and of course the ROC and the PRC, a U-shaped line concept, the three archipelagos of contentions, the Spratlys, Paracels, and Pratas, as well as the Macclesfield Bank and Scarborough Shoal, or the Bao de Masinloc. This is quite interesting because in the South China Sea, there is this map actually showing us the disposition of islands in the various states in Kalayaan. So let me show you a rundown of what happened before in 2012 up to the current. The friction between China and Philippines, wherein the Scarborough Shoal happened, the fire cross, of course the victory, that's what ruled by the Permanent Arbitration Court in favor with the Philippines, and of course its final verdict, which was released by the PAC, favoring the Philippines argument, highlighting our claim in the South China Sea. Now, the implication is of course shown here, which I would not discuss further because I do not have any time for this, but I hope you can see that even though there is what we call the friction between the Philippines and China, the trade balance between Philippines, China, and USA are still in control. So the analysis, I hope you can still give me at least one more minute. South China Sea understandably attracts the conduct of so-called intelligence gathering activities, specifically in the eminent naval power of China. Second is the unimpeded commerce. Third would be the very essence of the EEZ, or the exclusive economic zone, is very important. And of course, it underscores the importance of the ecosystems economically and the vital sea lanes of communication, or the SLOC, among states. Politically, US and China over the origins are quite handling the lack of cooperation until now, not necessarily the COVID-19, but at the same time in handling this code of conduct among these ASEAN member states. And my personal recommendation is, of course, to pursue separate but parallel complementary actions between Australia, Japan, Singapore, Indonesia, EU, and of course India, to advance the so-called Indo-Pacific and of course Quad power. So Philippines must start building its own modern military power, and of course a very competitive economy to at least advance the proper budgeting allocations for the armed forces of the Philippines. So last but not the least, we have to push for the code of conduct among the ASEAN member states, because I believe that even the Philippines had its chairmanship in 2016 or 27. I guess other states like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar are not really cooperative to push for this code of conduct. So last but not the least, is the development of code of conduct. We need, hopefully the US would assist us, and the ASEAN integration is, although it's quite far away, we are still pushing for a one and unified Filipino voice. Once again, the multilateral approach is very important even in the midst of trial like this. And the Philippine government has to adopt a more concrete policy, not only the military action, but of course, a more effective strategic communications among its members. Now, I want to highlight this because it's a very important article that we have written before.
You'll have to
Yes.
wrap up now because the other
All right.
speaker. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. I thought that was extremely insightful, especially your point about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguousness. I thought, could you stop sharing your screen so that we can see the. Thank you so much. Well, I thought your points about that is critical, especially I thought what you brought out was that when you look at the world today, it's not very easy in terms of how even the US is going to project its power.
Yes.
And so I thought that framework was very interesting. The second point that you raised was that even when it comes to the South China Sea, because the fact that the environment is so complex, you have different alignments, it might not be as simple as it is. For instance, China laying claim and the other countries countering it, right? And so thank you for that. I do have a few questions for you, but we'll talk about that in the interactive session. So our next speaker is going to be Fatemeh Aman. She's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council South Asia Center, Washington, DC. She's going to present on China in the Middle East. Fatemeh, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you so very much for having me on this, extraordinary conference. It's incredible. I will start with a very brief background on China's presence in the Middle East, and then we'll talk about, China's interest in the region and whether they are simply economic or also broader than that. And I will very briefly also discuss China's unique approach to securing its interests in the region. During the Cold War, the Middle East was divided, albeit not equally, between a pro-Soviet camp and a pro-US camp. China as a Soviet rival and did not have a significant independent presence in MENA region, in Middle East, North African region. The presence emerged after the Cold War and later out of ramification of the Arab Spring, including falling oil prices and a gradual US disengagement from the region. These factors contributed to China's expanded and I could describe it as most welcome in the region. Today China is the largest importer of crude oil in the world, with half of it being supplied from the Middle East. China is the second largest trading partner to Middle Eastern countries overall, and has economic partnership with 15 countries in the region, including Iran and Israel. I will briefly mention the significance of that. Interestingly, China's involvement in Israel's high-tech sector has generated some U.S. opposition, as has its potential involvement in a developing Haifa port, which is close to a base used by the U.S. Navy. China has active relationship with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, with Iran, Oman, Egypt, Algeria, with the war-torn countries such as Syria and Libya, where its involvement has mostly focused on reconstruction than on participating in the conflict. So what's the driving factor for China's expanding presence in the Middle East? China-Middle East relations are based on mutual needs. China, simply put, needs natural resources and energy that the Middle East can offer. So for a destabilized Middle East affected by economic downturn due to factors such as falling oil price, conflict, high unemployment, high inflation, and growing populations, China is an economic savior somehow. So Middle Eastern countries need to diversify and shore up their economies and rebuild or develop their infrastructures. And all these objectives seem to be compatible with China's BRI. Economic needs are not the only reason, obviously, for China's growing presence in the Middle East. For many Middle Eastern countries, China has become a bargaining chip in their relations with the United States. So the availability of Chinese military, that's an example. Availability of Chinese military equipment has been used by some of the Persian Gulf states, to force the US to ease its restrictions on selling similar weaponry. Countries at odds with the US have also played the China card. It's now becoming more prominent, this China card, as they recently announced China and Iran long-term partnership agreement. I hope we will get a chance to talk about that. China's approach, what are they? I mean, as I mentioned before, the US disengagement from some parts of the Middle East has created more space for China to expand its presence. However, so far China has been very cautious not to antagonize the US too much. Beijing has not, for example, has not pressured Israel on projects that I just mentioned, to which Washington has objected. And it has delayed its involvement in several much needed projects in Iran, citing US sanctions. The truth is that the United States remains the primary security arbiter in the region. And this has benefited China by allowing it to focus mostly on its broad economic projects and project somehow a peacekeeping image for itself. China's balancing act, let me briefly talk about that. Unlike China's role in many other parts of the world, including in South Asia, in the Middle East, China has tried to balance its relations with regional rivals in order to protect its economic interests. This means Beijing has distanced itself from major conflicts in the region and rarely has played any role in easing geopolitical tension there. This balancing act has served China well in securing its main regional objectives: economic ties, trade, investment in infrastructures, and finance. It has also allowed China to, for example, pursue major economic projects in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, and Israel, despite the rivalries that exist between those countries. China has also managed so far not to risk its economic interests and ties with the US, by somehow moderating its relationship with Iran. On Iran and China, I hope I will get a chance to talk about the most recent 25 years, 400 billion, worth of $400 billion deal between Iran and China, if it's really, if there is no exaggeration in it. If the deal is real and China is going to be, you know, Iran's perhaps largest economic partner, then this poses several challenges for Beijing. Above all, it will need to maintain the balance in its relationship with other countries in the region. So that would mean expanding its economic ties to those countries to match its newly expanded link with Iran. In conclusion, I think several speakers in the previous session, one of the speakers, at least I remember, mentioned that, you know, if you are a friend of China, you would say, you might say China's aims are peacekeeping and power sharing. You would cite China's anti-piracy activities. You could argue that increasing physical connectivity and as it's provided by BRI or you know, Chinese telecommunication projects will bring people together. And if you are China or if you suspect, you know, China's motives, you would contend that China's aims are colonial and its goals its goal is to become a global superpower. The trend now in some part of the Middle East, especially in Iran, where the country of my birth. So the truth is that China has been able to escape responsibility for securing the Middle East region. You know, that task has been on United States and Russia in some ways. So this has smoothed China's emergence as a power in the Middle East. So, excuse me. It will be interesting to see, you know, what happens if the U.S. continues its regional disengagement further, and you know, when China is left to take on more of a polarizing security role, things could change and the calculation would certainly alter. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatemeh. You finished right on time, so thank you for that. I thought your points were interesting because I agree with you. Not many realize that China is actually a lead player in the Middle East. And as you mentioned, the second largest trading partner, you know, it has actually helped in reconstruction in Libya and Syria, and also Afghanistan to a large extent. So I think those points I don't see discussed even here in the US. So the fact that China has strong relationships with Iran, the country of your birth, and recently signed an agreement, including an agreement to share space capacity of area that I follow. So thank you for that. We'll have questions for you in the interactive session. So thank you for your excellent presentation. Thank you. So the next speaker that we have today is Parvez Karim Abbasi. He's an assistant professor with the East-West University, Bangladesh. And he's going to speak on China-Bangladesh relations and the quest for economic equiproximity. Parvez, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Goswami. Thank you. Let me say, first of all, that it's very nice to speak at a nice event, no pun intended. So let me straightforward go on to today's topic. And economists always love to quote facts and figures, but I'll try to keep it to a bare minimum. Excuse me. Now, the rise of China is an incontrovertible fact. A few facts, data can simply illustrate this point. In the early 1900s, in fact 1900 to be exact, China was just 6% of the US economy. In 2011, China amounted to 50% of the US economy. And by 2050, if everything goes all right, China is supposed to exceed the US economy by most estimates. And amount to at least 25% of the global economy. That only goes to show that how far China has actually emerged, or China's economic base has strengthened. And it has become the leading exporter of manufactured products. In fact, China is the lead exporter of manufacturing products to 43 countries. And when you see, excuse me, BRI, or Belt and Road Initiative, this is a concrete manifestation of the Chinese rise. Because the Chinese, after the last subprime mortgage crisis, realized that there needs to be some amount of decoupling from the US market. So as a result, they went for the 4 M's, right? Consume more, export more, innovate more, invest abroad more. So BRI is a concrete manifestation of this, and the geoeconomics of BRI, smart usage of trade policy, smart usage of investment policies, smart usage of complementary fiscal and monetary policies, all of those has given China a larger than life presence on the global arena. Now, along with this, we already, I think this has been covered in by many of the speakers, America's apparent withdrawal from the multilateral globalized model that they had advocated since the 1990s has meant that China somehow has become the unwitting holder of the global multilateral system in many people's eyes. So, and that has also meant that China, and this is where we are coming to South Asia, and China's entry into South Asia. China has been there in South Asia for quite a long time. But it is since the 90s that China's presence has magnified. And what we should bear into context about some certain salient features about South Asia is that number one, South Asia is the least integrated region in the world. Highest levels of poverty, massive levels of unemployment, low science and tech base, except for India, let's say. And along with this, again, there is a degree of political instability. With this context, when China has come into South Asia, especially with BRI, things have come, what would I say? Things have quickened up. In terms of Bangladesh, and we see in recent times, there's a lot of report about Bangladesh's growing proximity to China. Well, there is only one aspect to this, because many of the South Asian nations, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's Sri Lanka, whether it's Nepal, Bangladesh, even India, their trade volumes to China has gone up. With India, it's around over $90 billion, even despite border crashes and skirmishes. And with Bangladesh, what's always pointed out that there's a $17 billion trade relationship with $17 billion of Chinese managed to export to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh manages to only export $1 billion. And that is the only fact that is being illustrated. But I would like to argue that China is a very important player, but it is not the only player. Because if you just take into account India, with India, we share probably the 5th largest border in the world. With the trade with India is over $10 billion. And why am I mentioning these facts? Because India exports over $9.5 billion to Bangladesh, and we export $1 billion. But if you take into account informal trade, which is around 40 to 50% of the actual official statistics, the actual figures is much larger. And along with this, our largest export market is still United States of America. And again, if you take in terms of destination, European Union is by far the biggest bloc where we invest. A huge source of remittance comes in from Middle East. Japan is a firm development partner. So whenever we say that all of the South Asian countries are jumping onto the BRI bandwagon, we have to use a certain degree of caveat. Because again, we are using an old financial trick. Almost every country is. You cannot put all your eggs in one basket. With SAARC, what has happened? We had SAPTA, we had SAFTA. So intra-regional trade has not actually taken off for various reasons. And along with this, what has happened is when we went for sub-regional trade, BBIN, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, or sub-regional connectivity, all of those things, yes, there has been some progress. India has invested around $9 to $10 billion, or in terms of letter of credit, increasing multimodal transport connectivity and transit. But again, these things take time. What is already, usually being focused is that China has pledged to invest $40 billion in Bangladesh along the BRI projects. But one thing that needs to be highlighted is only $1 billion has been disbursed so far. We'll go into the reasons behind this. So, and along with this, some other news that we tend not to include is Japan in recent times has come up with $3.5 billion aid or actually development assistance package. So, and this, so all of those facts, if I now can, I've just given you a broad collage of information, bombarded with data and figures. Now let's come to the perspectives over here. Number one, often we talk about, oh, the Chinese are investing, so Bangladesh is going to go into a debt trap. And this is a Chinese debt trap, is an elephant in the room. Usually when I say elephant in the room, I actually look at myself. But again, in this case, we are talking about the alleged Chinese debt. Now over here, now let's examine the facts. Bangladesh's total debt is only $33 billion. We have more money than this in our foreign exchange reserve, which is $37 billion. So we can pay off our debt at one go. What is the amount of debt that we owe to China? Only 6% of our external debt. And most of the loans that the Chinese provide us is in terms of commercial rates. So it's actually at market rates. And the Bangladeshi policymakers have been quite specific in terms of their long experience of negotiating development packages, that they prefer equity-based investment as opposed to debt finance investments. Because with equity-based investments, you have partnership. And one very good example is our special economic zones, which is reflective of Bangladesh's principle of economic equiproximity. What is that? Now, in case of a special economic zones, the Chinese have invested. The Japanese have promised to invest. The Koreans are going to invest. And also, the Indians have also invested. So the Adani Group or the Reliance Group, there are two special economic zones for this. The Chinese are investing in power plants. The Indians are investing in power plants. The Japanese are investing in infrastructure. The Chinese are investing in infrastructure. And remember, again, one bears in mind that South Asian countries are not going in a knee-jerk reaction because allegedly we are envious of the big brother. It is not so. The idea is, of course, with a neighbor, you will have a lot of problems, because this is one thing that I also write in my columns and my articles too. The idea is that our development needs are what? Infrastructure and power generation. Bangladesh has made rapid strides. From LDC, we have moved on to a low middle income country. But now we need to go for the next big push. And for that, we require infrastructural development. For that, we require power generation. So we require funds. So the Indians are investing, the Japanese are investing, and again, for that matter, European Union also, UK is investing. So we are taking the investment as and where it is required. But there are some areas that we need to be actually mindful. What are the areas that we are mindful about? And we are also cognizant that if you simply say, oh, investment is decoupled from politics, we are not saying so. Because if you invest more, you also have a leverage on the policy making process. So just like other South Asian countries also, Bangladesh is also a zone of contestation. But we must be wary of, as a South Asian country, not to fall into a great game rivalry. Because remember, that would only breed instability in the country. Number two is, the number two question is that again, we must be very cognizant about how much investment we can take. Just because it's not like a credit card offer that I will buy everything without any amount of collateral. So whoever comes in, we have to say whether this investment actually fits our actual requirements or not. And do we have the ability to pay this off? And number three, we should be very wary of playing off allegedly big powers, whether it's India against China or China against India, because remember, these are countries which have had long-standing relationship with each other. Tensions might have been exacerbated at the moment, but they can also subside. And when you also hear about issues such as US Indo-Pacific strategy or the Quad 4 and so on and so forth, And again, remember, US economic policies or US geostrategic policies somehow are also influenced by domestic political requirements, which are quite cyclical in nature. So again, what our key aim, and I think this,
you have about a minute to wrap up.
I'll wrap it up. So like most South Asian nations, and I'll be happy to answer many questions that might be raised. Over here, our key issues is we should take in only the investment that is specifically required for development purposes. And number two, we should not take sides, because we cannot afford to be in the middle of a free-for-all shootout. So, and again, and right now, instability in South Asia is not in anyone's best interests. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you, Mr. Pravesh. I thought what you did so well is to kind of address some of the myths about, for instance, the debt trap, right? So to give figures and to explain your case was excellent. I also enjoyed listening to how, I think one of the questions you raised was that, is China the only investor? But I thought your presentation also highlighted the fact that there are other countries that are investing in Bangladesh. And for instance, Japan, as you mentioned, relation with India. And so I think you have questions in the chat. So I would urge all panelists to look at the chat and see if you have any questions directly to you, so you can familiarize yourself and think through. We have the next panelist now, Ms. Rafaela Melo Rodriguez Disa. She's a student of international relations at Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She's going to talk on Brazil-China relations, trade exchange through para-diplomacy. The floor is yours, Ms. Rafaela.
Thank you. Everyone listen me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
I will share my screen. So just a sec. Okay, everyone seeing my screen? Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the event organization team to invite me to this speak about the Brazilian relations, Brazilian-China relations in a subnational sphere. But before that, it's important to analyze the trade relation between the two countries in a historical perspective in order to understand some tendencies. So, next slide. Well, according to the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, since 2009, China is Brazil's main trading partner. The Brazil-China trade flow has expanded in the past decade from $3.2 billion in 2001, increased to $19.8 billion in 2019. The main Brazilian export agenda toward China is made up of agricultural products, mainly grains such as soybeans. In this graphic, it is possible to see the proportion of Brazilian agricultural products exported to China, marked by the orange and the blue one. Besides that, Brazilian is famous to export products from livestock, such as meat and chicken. And another export sector with great relevance is the extraction of minerals and the export of oil-related products. In China's side, the investment in higher product value-added production resulted in exportation of manufactured products and high-tech items to Brazil. However, the current Brazilian foreign policy led by President Jair Bolsonaro has a tendency to ally with the United States and European countries. Certain recent events during the COVID-19 pandemic and even during the Bolsonaro campaign have created some diplomatic discomfort with China. Despite this, international trade between Brazil and China was not directly affected. But this situation have created possibilities for subnational entities such as states or cities to increase international relations with China, especially during the pandemic. So the role of subnational entities in international system is related by the globalization process. Subnational actors have a new function in this context, to be the nodal points of the global economy. Even though national states still have a central role in the debate of international relations, it is possible to analyze a growing movement of subnational actors which have a certain level of autonomy in order to enable the development of local territories based on international activities. Most of the cooperation between these actors pursue a common objective, local development, increasing the international projection, the attraction of investment, tourists, and companies, and the promoting of export of products and services. This phenomenon is called power diplomacy. So cooperation in this sense can provide development for both sides in a way that encourage subnational actors to work together to achieve the best condition. In a multilateral sphere, there are some cooperation mechanisms between BRIC cities that include cities from Brazil and China, providing conditions for development and trade exchange in the BRICS level. Now we are going to analyze the power diplomacy sphere in the two countries. So in Brazil, the constitutions provides exclusive responsibility for national states to define Brazil international relations, which central government is responsible for the foreign policy formulation. So the constitutions does not provide legal authorization for the external action of subnational government. However, the Brazilian legislation determines the federalism as a political system granting legal, political, and administrative autonomy to other federal entities, such as states and municipalities. In order to overcome this contradiction, some ways of legitimizing the exercise of power diplomacy in Brazil were presented. The main way to analyze the foreign policy of federative entities is through the creation of AFEPA, Advisor on Federative and Parliamentary Affairs, in 2003, establishing a mechanism to promote the dialogue between the subnational actors and the Foreign Policy Council. In addition, the National Federation of Municipalities can also be analyzed as an instrument to assist the international performance of subnational actors, since it aims to strengthen autonomy of Brazilian municipalities. In China, for the other side, the use of term power diplomacy is not common, since there is a perception that subnational governments are only complementary actors to the initiatives of Chinese central government, which is seen as the only responsible for foreign policy. Even so, the Chinese government has some initiatives that allow subnational actors to have great autonomy, creating policies to internationalization of their territories. Among some of these initiatives, the Foreign Affairs Office stands out, having great relevance in the construction of international cooperation between local actors. The Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference has the objective to advise decision-making process regarding public diplomacy directed abroad. Another one is the Chinese People Association for Friendship and Foreign Countries, an association that encourages friendship and cooperation between Chinese and foreigners through people-to-people diplomacy. And there are the China International Friendship City Association, an association more focused on subnational actors, which serves as an instrument for coordination between the Chinese cities and the sister cities around the world. So, just a sec. Okay, going to the main point of this paper, the trade between Brazilian subnational governments with Chinese entities intensifying during the COVID-19 pandemic, mainly with the sending of protective equipment, respirators, and masks to Brazilian federal states. However, before the pandemic, the trade activities between the two countries at the subnational level were already taking place. The main initiative in this regard is the opening of a commercial office of a government of São Paulo in the city of Shanghai in last year, with the objective of expanding economic relations with China. Another initiative that already existed before the pandemic, but received preeminence during this period, is the Northeast Consortium, which consists of 9 federal states in the Northeast region of Brazil and was founded in March 2019. One of the aim of this institution is to increase export of production and services on a larger scale. In this direction, it is important to illustrate some subnational initiatives facing the COVID-19 pandemic effects. Now, both the states of Maranhão and state of Ceará in Northeast region used the consortium to carry out commercial operations from the purchase of respirators and masks from China in order to equip hospitals and health professionals during the pandemic. So, it is possible to analyze cooperation efforts between subnational entities that goes beyond trade. The main example during the pandemic was the partnership between the state of São Paulo with Sinovac Biotech, a Chinese company, in order to implement a third phase of testing for a COVID-19 vaccine. In concluding, this demonstrates that the commercial relation between subnational actors can create potential in other fields, generating a spillover effect of cooperation, indicating the need to strengthen South-South cooperation, not only between national states, but also in subnational entities. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present this.
Thank you, Ms. Rafaela. I thought your presentation, I found it insightful because I think, again, as with the presentation on the Middle East, I think there are assumptions that the relationship between Brazil and China is very much state determined and that it's mostly state institutions. But what I see from your presentation is that within the Chinese Foreign Ministry, there are also organizations that engage with entities that are not just state, as we saw even during the pandemic. In fact, you'll be surprised at how much that particular cooperation between China and Brazil during the pandemic was covered here in the US in terms of ventilators, medicines, medical help. So we'll have questions for you. I have been told that our last presenter, Taki Haidari, BRI fellow from Afghanistan, has not been able to join us. Is that the situation still? Nice
yes.
organized?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I had been sent a list of questions from the registered participants, and I think the best way to do this is that we have about half an hour for question and answer. So please again, look at your chat if you have questions directed to you. But let's start with in order of the first presenter. So Dr. Pop, I think the question that has come for you, and I think you are the best to handle this, is that what will the world order and global norms be like if China becomes a superpower or hegemon like the US? Is there any chance of power blocks between US and China, just like during the Cold War between the US and Soviet Union? And I think a connected question to that is, how can small states prepare for China's rise? You have about 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you for the questions. When we talk about the possibility of the two power blocks, a constant in China's foreign policy was to prevent the creation of coalitions against it. And for example, we have Lili Min, who talk about in his articles and studies about, and he said that China's priorities in the long term should be to assure supremacy in the Asia-Pacific region, to monitor the actions of the United States, to grow its influence, for example, in Africa, Latin America, Middle East, and of course to control also Japan, India, and Russia. And from an economic point of view, it doesn't have so many disagreements with European Union. And he said that it should be preferable to find an economic solution for this. So as we can see, Lily Min being one of their most known geopoliticians, they prepare for the possibility of let's say a bipolar world. So they try to watch carefully all the great players in the field, and I think we will assist for 1 decade or more at what we see now, because I have another point here. I don't think that before 2050 China can succeed to bring out of poverty the majority of its population. And from this point of view, she will try to keep a balanced approach, more aggressive maybe in the neighborhood, and more pragmatic in the other areas of the world. And if you can repeat a little bit the second question, please. I didn't write it.
I'm just reading it to you. Just a minute.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. The second question is this: is there any chance of power blocks between US and China, just like during the Cold War between US and Soviet Union? And the final question is, how can small states prepare for China's rise?
The small states, they will be under a lot of pressure from both sides, I think. And regarding the Cold War politics, we see that in, for example, military affairs, China tried to invest more and more, and take into account the CP reports. I think right now it invests is the second after the United States as a budget. And on the other hand, we see that China tried to make its own weapons now, not just to buy from Russian and others. And we talk here about they are already capable to innovate in terms of military weapons. So, and if we talk about energy, renewable energy, technology, and so on, these are areas where China already is in the top, for example. And if we look at the 10 major companies in the world who invest, for example, in renewable energy, China has 5 or 6. So what I observe here, that they learn very quickly, and they are capable to transform the information and the knowledge and intellectual rights, everything, and to innovate and produce in sometimes better solutions. So yes. If we think about economic aspect of the problem, I don't know how both countries can keep in the long term, because even China has a regression as a budget, for example, this year from 10%.
I think we can wrap up, and somebody has started sharing their screen, so I can see someone's Gmail in my.
Okay.
I'm sorry, there was a distraction because
And I think a very frozen competition between the two powers would not be good for any of us. And I think both countries, also the United States and also China, should carefully design their strategy, because maybe the rest of us, it doesn't, we don't agree with any of them, with extreme, with let's say very opposite positions. And I also asked Kerry Brown, for example.
Dr. Pop, because we have a lot of other questions. So
Okay, thank you.
you.
I will come back if it is necessary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much. So the questions for Dr. Uma. So one question is how US is going to impact Russia's policy towards Asia in general and China in particular. And the second question I think is interesting because it asks, how can China ensure Russia to be on Beijing's side in the future of China's power politics?
Namrata, can you repeat the second question, please?
Sure, absolutely. The second question is, how can China ensure Russia to be on Beijing's side in this future of great power politics? Okay. And I think that's an interesting question because there are questions that are asked in international relations as to, will China-Russia relation repeat what happened between China and the Soviet Union when Mao became uncomfortable? So yeah, the floor is yours, Uma. You have about 2 minutes.
So the first question about how the US can influence Russia's policy towards Asia, right? This is something which a lot of strategic thinkers in the US have been debating. How does the US re-engage with Russia, and what are the benefits of re-engaging with Russia? For instance, if the US is able to, if it wants Russia's help in its Asia policy, really the US should be looking, again, like I said, at the strategic triangle. It should be looking at re-engaging Russia. Again, like I said in my presentation, for Russia, the most important relationship still remains the United States. So any re-engagement that the United States can do with Russia will actually help it tilt the balance towards the United States, particularly vis-a-vis China. So, Russia has always been very Western oriented in its outlook. It's always seen itself as a European power. And even during the 1990s, it was NATO's eastward expansion, which was, again, some of the promises that the United States made, which really made the Russians turn towards China in a sense. So an embrace of, if you look at it very strategically, the number one power in the world in the United States right now is the United States. The second is China, and the third is Russia. So if the United States strategic goal is to contain China or to remain the preponderant power in China, it makes sense to just reach out to the Russians. But the problem is that the United States has this deep state, which still has a Cold War mentality, and till such time as the deep state allows the president to take that jump, I don't see that happening very soon, even if it's Biden who is elected. The second on how can Beijing ensure that Russia stays on China's side. One is that you see the Russians really need to diversify their economy, move away from just being a source of energy and raw materials. So if the Chinese can supply high technology to the Russians, but I find that difficult. I mean, I don't know if that's possible because China itself is coming under sanctions. It itself depends a lot on the West for a lot of technology. But if the Chinese can invest more in helping develop the Russian Far East without raising Russia's hackles about Sinification of the Russian Far East, and if the Chinese continue to treat the Russians as an equal power, even though the Russians are in a state of decline, then I think Beijing will be able to kind of let Russia stay on its part. Look, unlike most of China's neighbors, the Russians and the Chinese have reached a modus vivendi, or they have a border agreement. So that's resolved once and for all. And if the Chinese Communist Party can control some of the nationalists on social media from, talking about the unequal treaties, of being overtly nationalist, then I guess the Russians will remain on China's side. But I suspect that the Russians are still waiting for that rapprochement from the West. So the scales are, I think, tilted a little against the Chinese in any case.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We have a few questions for Mr. Jamal as well. So one of the questions which I think is interesting is that how is China going to navigate in a world where there is a global sentiment against China's assertive behavior in the South China Sea? And then I think you have a question from chat as well. I am not able to see it, but I saw that there was a question for you. But if you can see it, then please read it out and then answer that. And then my question to you is that under President Rodriguez, Philippines seems to have adopted a policy of greater relationship with China when he came into power. So how do you think that affects the long-term standing of Philippines vis-a-vis the China-US competition in the South China Sea?
Well, I thank you for the wonderful question, Dr. Namrata Goswami. I believe that the first and last question are quite related, but at some point we have to distinguish the thin line. I believe that we can view that the first and third question can be viewed based on the conditions and possibilities in a two-level game. Well, that's my own perspective. I mean, economic terms, the maximum gain for both sides, like for example, China and Philippines, would be a monopoly over the exploitation of resources in the South China Sea. China would still have an advantage as for example, natural gas and oil can be extracted by the Chinese companies, while on the other hand, in the Philippines would need to attract foreign companies despite the high risk of conflict with China. And that, of course, as mentioned earlier by Dr. Namrata, is a growing sentiment, or for example, distrust against China. Like for example, in the recent incident in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and in the Philippines, as regard to fishing, both countries are quite autonomous, but this activity is proportionally more relevant to determine if China is actually serious with their leveraging with the ASEAN member states. The ideal resolution for this current impasse would be a joint exploration by China and Philippines as being pushed by the President Rodrigo President Duterte. And as process that standard during the Arroyo government, the government prior to Aquino administration in 2004, including Vietnam, there was a discontinued few years later due to a mutual trust. I believe that the question being laid down last by Dr. Namrata is a perfect question to see the lens of most Filipinos having this high distrust with President Xi Jinping and the Chinese government, vis-a-vis the Communist Chinese Party. That seems like a new perspective in IR right now, because I believe that in strategic gains in terms, the basic asymmetry between two countries like China and Philippines creates different expectations of a resolution. The Chinese parameter involved the historical narrative, as they claim in South China Sea, of the centrality of its tribune system in Southeast Asia. But there is a conception of a southern borders on land and sea as expansive and mobility, unlike the rather defensive and the static borders in the north and west. The notion is under the siege of West, due to the U.S. system of hubs and spokes, above all material force used by a strong and organized state to project power over a region, it does not host any major powers or countries with this capability to counter China. I believe that President Duterte is doing this just to at least lighten up the tension between Philippines and China. But I also see in a personal point of view as an analyst that there is a danger if the Philippines would not push for the rule of law, because United States is, of course, after the arbitration court's ruling in 2016, this is actually the 4th year wherein most analysts, not only in the Philippines, are viewing this as a defeatist approach with the President Duterte. But I'm also having few reservation that hopefully by the next 2 years or the last 2 years of President Duterte would give at least a room for some changes. Because if not, then it would not only affect the next step by their party for 2022, because by 2022 there would be a national election in the Philippines. Just in case that would give a bad reputation or perception from the Filipinos to the way Duterte administration is addressing the South China Sea, then definitely it would really affect politically and economically.
Well, thank you. That was excellent. So I'm glad you brought the contemporary and also the fact that 2020 or there's an election coming.
Yes,
so that might change the policy. Thank you. So the next questions are for Ms. Fatemeh. So one of the questions that has been posed from the chat, you must have seen it, that can China's structural power bring the two antagonistic giants, Iran and the Arab world, into the negotiating table to stabilize the Middle East? So basically the argument is that since the world recognizes China as a great power, or rather the new global hegemon, will China play a role in terms of bringing together the Arab world with Iran? My question to you is that, do you think the China card that is being used, as you mentioned in your presentation, by the Middle East backfire? Because as you saw, President Trump reacts very negatively to the use of the China card. So do you think that would backfire? And finally, I'll be very interested to hear your perspective on the current UAE-Israel deal that happened, by which Israel agreed not to continue with its sovereignty claims in the West Bank. So do you think that has an impact and leverages the US position in the Middle East vis-a-vis China? Thank you.
There are so many questions. Let me, start with the one that I saw in the chat, whether or not China would be able to play a more mediatory role between Iran and say, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. As I mentioned in my talk, it has not been China's concern in bringing rivals together. In fact, China's gain and all this expansion and progress that has been made, has economic gain that China has made, is partly, some people believe, partly to the approach that it's taking, just not get involved with the differences, stay away, be friend with everyone, and focus on your, economic gains. That's what China has done so far. And if you remember, I mentioned that once the United States, if this engagement continues, and then China would be forced to take side, basically. Maybe then China would try to bring its friends together, which so far has not been. China has not played any peacemaking role at this in that very volatile and unstable region. With China card, you see, let me just mention the most recent agreement between Iran and China that was announced by Javad Zarif, Iran foreign minister, in July, not long time ago. If it's true, China has kept quiet, has not made made so much publicity around it, but Iran has made. As a response, I would describe it to, this U.S. policy of maximum pressure to force Iran to change behavior and not, on just leaving its proxies here and there. So that policy has put Iran to the, Iran's economy to the edge of collapse. It has decreased, Iran's oil production dramatically, has put Iran's health system on the, which is overwhelmed by COVID-19, and all these incredibly broad sanctions, economic sanctions on Iran. So that is where Iran is playing China card. So if China card would have backlash if China would have stayed away from Iran, and Iran would not have publicized the most recent deal. But in fact, they are making, there is also a discussion now in the US as whether or not those that maximum pressure policy was successful. It wasn't. It pushed Iran more and more, toward China, and with that contract of 25 years and $400 billion, if there is no exaggeration in that, that would include infrastructure, military aid, and you name it, or railroad development in the Chabahar port. So China card has been successful so far, has not backlashed yet. As to, I think I mentioned that, what else? I'm sorry, I forgot. I think there was one more question. Oh, with UAE and Israel. You know that many Arab countries, many Arab states have this, their relationship with Israel. It's kept secret, but they are, is not something that started really 2 or 3 days ago. Some people would describe it as kind of, that's not the correct word to say, but would describe it as theatrical even. Since first of all, UAE and Israel have been in relations also with other countries, Israel and Kingdom also. I don't know if we can describe it as gain for Palestinians, say, something that Netanyahu announced, and now he has to satisfy the more hardline, people in Israel that were supporting his announcement that West Bank should be, part of Israel. So he didn't lose anything by saying that, and I think the aim was also somehow to support to influence the upcoming U.S. election. But I wouldn't necessarily describe it as something dramatic, something, it's not even the Camp David of, back then with Egypt and Israel, not even Oslo talk. It's something that is going to be reversible if Netanyahu's party feels he has to do.
Thank you so much. We have a question. So next would be Mr. Parvesh. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, Dr. Goswami.
Yes, so you do have a comment, I think, but then the more focused question for you is, I think the question that I would have is that given the fact that China's Belt and Road Initiative and engagement, say with South Asia, is looked at from the perspective of President Xi's China Dream and an extension of Chinese influence, Japan doesn't have such an overarching foreign policy goal, or the other countries you mentioned. So does that impact how analysis is done on China's engagement with Bangladesh and the concerns that are raised?
Well, yes and no. It depends on again which perspective that you're taking in. Because yes, I do understand, and the fact that again any investment that you carry out, economic investment, as I already mentioned, is not independent of by itself, because it also brings in a certain level of strategic heft. And it's very well known that BRI is the Chinese version of the Marshall Plan, or Marshall Plan with Chinese characteristics. So Chinese sphere of influence is extending. And traditionally, South Asia was viewed as, again, India's, let's say, sphere of influence. Let's put it in a more politically correct manner. So what has happened over here is Chinese, well, the Indians would say Chinese intrusion, the Chinese would say Chinese engagement, but again, Chinese presence in South Asia, which has gone on for quite some time. Now, this has taken on quite a different dimension, because till date, if you look, and I'm just again trying to make the questions more relevant, because, and I again go back to this, most of the criticism that has come for Chinese engagement within South Asia has been from a certain segment of Indian media or intelligentsia. And again, they might have their valid concerns, and that is again reflective of their own national interests. But the idea was that, again, India and China itself has engaged on a $90 billion plus trade volume. This is again, and this a sort of apprehension is there amongst the other South Asian nations. I won't say smaller South Asian nations, but the less visible South Asian nations, for example, Sri Lanka, Nepal, or Bangladesh, that is Chinese trade or Chinese investment is kosher or halal if it's in India. But again, when the investment goes away in smaller nations, then there's a lot of hue and cry raised. I'm saying that's one perspective. And along with this, you have to see that whenever we have Western engagement, these are literally viewed as strings attached. Because again, there are so many things that over there that you have to say. So this is, again, see, we have to take it in a post-colonial, post-nationalist discourse. So over here, what has happened is the constant preaching, allegedly constant preaching or quantification of the West. Now, whether it's about human rights or whether it's about, and even we see that the Indians reacting when the Americans come up with on human rights and so on and so forth. So almost, and what has happened is with growing levels of income, there's a degree of self-respect. Let me just give you one point. When there was a Podda Bridge, the Chinese flagstone project, BRI project in Bangladesh, initially it was supposed to be carried out with World Bank financing. So there was questions about allegations actually of conspiracy to collude in terms of corruption, which was later on proved to be unfounded according to World Bank statement. This is where China came in, and this was China's first major thrust. And in Bangladesh, what you have right now is actually infrastructural diplomacy by the Chinese, because we have a glaring deficiency in terms of infrastructural funds. So as a result, the Chinese are coming in. And the next possible step would be vaccine diplomacy. If a successful vaccine is found, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, or even it's India, there will be a growing zone of accommodation for those countries. And with the United States of America, yes, they have been our trusted development partner. But remember, with the United States, I can speak from the Bangladeshi perspective, that it's all right to talk about democracy, good governance, so on and so forth. But Bangladesh was, even a few days back, the second largest ready-made garments apparel exporter. Now it's the third largest. Vietnam has just overtaken us. For the longest period of time, we have been talking about duty-free, quota-free access. But we pay 15.3% tariff. Bangladesh pays a tariff worth $1 billion to sell around $7 billion worth of product in the US market. And all of a sudden, you have the Chinese coming in and saying, well, it's been ongoing for a long time under APTA. So 97% of Bangladeshi exports will get duty-free access. It's another thing that the 97% commodities on which this duty-free, quota-free access has been provided, do we have the capacity to produce this? Let's say you're giving us the capacity to export cars. We cannot produce cars, but that doesn't matter. It makes for good optics. And yes, we are cognizant of the fact that there is growing level of Chinese investment will bring about Western apprehension, will bring about Indian consternation. But again, we have to look to our own strategic interests, because
can you wrap up, because we have about 4 minutes left.
Okay.
I want to, but we got
yeah, sure. No, certainly. So the one thing that I'm just wrapping it up in 30 seconds. The one thing that all of South Asia must realize that this is an era of conflict, this is an era of cooperation, and this is an era of coercion. So it depends on which aspect that you're looking into. So again, that I think I will wrap it up like this. Thank you, Dr. Goswami.
Thank you so much. We have a question for Ms. Rafaela, which is very interesting. So the question is, how do you see China-Brazil relations after Brazil's president, Bolsonaro's strong criticism of China on the coronavirus? Even Chinese diplomats adopted an offensive stand against Brazil and termed this rhetoric as under the influence of the USA. So given the fact, do you see any type of significant tussle or conflict between China and American interests in Brazil?
Well, I think this is an excellent question, because I think it's the main question that we should ask to understand the Brazil-China relations nowadays. Well, I think the position of Brazil foreign policy is taking an ideological line with US, but not with the state itself, but with the Trump delegation. So the US election could bring some impact in Brazil and in Bolsonaro's strategy if Trump will not be re-elected. So the US relation with Brazil is essential to understand the relation with China, the Brazil relation with China, and this offensive rhetoric that Bolsonaro and his sons and all this team get. But I believe that there are some pragmatic actors in both countries that could stabilize the relations between the Brazil and China. So the Brazilian Vice President, Hamilton Mourão, is one of the Brazilian offices that engage on close relations with China. Not only him, but the great base of Bolsonaro in Congress that support the agribusiness. So keep the relation with China is essential to maintain the trade. So it's very important. Another point is that the new president of the new development bank is the Max Troijo, a Brazilian diplomat that was vice minister of economy in Bolsonaro office. So this demonstrates some kind of interest of Bolsonaro in the BRICS agreement. And so there are incentives to keep China and Brazil relation and to keep the Brazil in BRICS. So I see some incentives in both sides. That's it.
Thank you so much. I think we are right on time to end. What I did is I clubbed the questions together, so each of you got a chance to speak to the questions. Thank you so much. I thought this session was excellent. I learned a lot listening to all of you. I go back with a lot of ideas and inspiration. So thank you for your time. And thank you to NICE for organizing this conference on understanding China. I turn it over to Ms. Gupta now. Thank you so much. Thank you all for your time and your excellent presentations.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. We would like to thank our moderator for moderating this session. We would also like to sincerely thank all our panelists for their interesting presentation. The program would not have been possible without our wonderful audience and their questions. Thank you everyone for joining us today.